Hi everyone, welcome to this week's chapter recap. My name is Corie and we are reading through the entire Bible this year in 2021. If you're new here and you just clicked on this video and you're not sure what you're watching, I work for a ministry called Bible Discovery. We have a daily television program that takes people through the Bible in a year, every year. There's also a website, BibleDiscoveryTV.com. Everything's available here on YouTube or our website or on traditional TV. All of this information is in the description box below. And I wanted to show you this. This is our Bible Discovery Guide for March because it's a new month. Every month, if you get on our mailing list for a donation in literally any amount, it's just, participation in the ministry, helping us cover our costs. We will send you one of these each month if you ask for it. And what is inside? Let me show you. There is an article each month from my brother. That's my brother's article, my older brother. There is my article, just a short little blurb there. And then every single day of the month, there is a daily devotional and your assigned reading. So this is what I'm getting you caught up on so that you can successfully read through the Bible in 2021. Always exciting, always a great goal. So let's jump into it. This week, of course, we're recapping from Sunday, February the 28th till today, Saturday, March 6th. And that section of assigned reading is Joshua chapter 12 all the way to Judges chapter 13. So there's quite a bit of history here, and it's all related to the conquest of Canaan, the conquest of the Promised Land, the Israelites moving out of, they've come from the Exodus through the wilderness. Now they're going into the Promised Land, and they're pushing out all of the nations that had been living there, and they're taken up residence. So that's where we are in the scriptures today. Let's jump right in. We're in Joshua chapter 12. Now, Joshua 12 is a summary chapter. It is a list of defeated kings. It starts with the two kings that the Israelites defeated on the east side. I'm not very good with directions. That was that little pause there. The east side, I always have to see it in my head. Confession time, I guess. The east side of the Jordan River, Sihon and Og. This is before the actual official conquest of Canaan. And then there's 31 kings listed on the west side of the Jordan River. So that's in the Promised Land proper, the land of Canaan. So that is all Joshua chapter 12. Now, chapter 13, we get, Joshua is a very old man at this point. He's nearing the end of his life, but there are still very large areas of the Promised Land that Israel has not taken over yet. So the Philistines are mentioned, the Geshurites are mentioned as people still living in the land among Israel. Now, the Geshurites are particularly important because later King David will actually make a marriage alliance, a treaty with the king of Geshur, and the product of that marriage is Absalom, and he will turn out to be a troublemaker within Israel and for David, to say the least. Okay, so we also learn how the land was divided on the east of the Jordan River between Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So it goes back through that history in chapter 13. So in Joshua chapter 14, then, we're still looking at land divisions, but this time we're beginning to look on that west side of the Jordan River, what we traditionally think of as Israel today, because it's modern Israel. So we're told that Eleazar the priest, so that's the son of Aaron, and Joshua, the son of Nun, so the leader of Israel, they decide the land inheritances by lot. So by using the Urim and Thummim, and we learn later that they're doing this in front of the tabernacle of God. So it's in the presence of God. That's the idea, to use the Urim and Thummim. We learn about a special allotment for Caleb. So remember, Caleb and Joshua are the only really old part of the older generation of Israelites that were able to make it into the Promised Land because of their faithfulness to God. So both Joshua and Caleb were promised a special inheritance. So we get the record of what that was for Caleb. It involved the very famous city of Hebron. We know that later in chapter 21, the city of Hebron is also given to the Kohathites. It's a Levitical city of refuge, but it's clarified that Caleb gets all of the pasture land and all of the fields around the city of Hebron. So it must have been some good land because everyone wanted a piece of it. Joshua chapter 15, we learn about the tribe of Judah's land allotment, which is appropriate because Caleb is a part of Judah, so it began with Caleb, and now we're looking at the tribe of Judah. We also get some footnotes here on how Caleb actually took over the territory that was given to him, how he drove out 3 Anakites, which were really powerful warriors, giants of men. And we're also told how Othniel won Caleb's daughter in marriage. It was one of those scenarios where Caleb needed to take over a city. No one wanted to do it because of how fierce the city was. So he promised whoever did it successfully would be able to marry into his family through his daughter. Once Caleb's daughter marries Othniel, she actually asks her dad for more territory. So he gives her an inheritance as her marriage dowry. But then she goes and she asks her father for a water source for this land, which would have been a really important thing to own in that territory, a very valuable thing to own. And Caleb gives it to her. Now, there's also a footnote here in chapter 15 about Jerusalem and how to the day that Joshua, the book of Joshua, was being written, Jebusites were still living in Jerusalem with the tribe of Judah. We know that the city of Jerusalem was temporarily taken by Judah. We learn that in Judges chapter 1. But the Jebusites, so the native people of Jerusalem, were still living alongside the Israelites at that time. It's not fully taken over until the time period of David. Okay. Joshua chapter 16, we learn about Ephraim and Manasseh's allotment. Remember, Ephraim and Manasseh were both Joseph's sons, but Joseph got a double blessing. So his son Ephraim and his son Manasseh are their own tribes in Israel along with their uncles. There's a note here that Ephraim was unable to dislodge the Canaanites in the city of Gezer. The city of Gezer will show up again at a later time. In chapter 17, we have the tribal allotment of Manasseh is continued. We learn about their struggle with Canaanites who had iron chariots, and they end up asking Joshua for more territory. They want territory that's already cleared, that doesn't have people or iron chariots in it. Joshua said, don't be afraid of the iron chariots, and also take the forested hill country. Go in and build your own cities, which would have been a lot more work, but it's interesting being able to see kind of the inner workings of the politics of Israel at that time, and that's what we see there. Okay, Joshua chapter 18, we learn that the tent tabernacle of Moses was actually set up in the city of Shiloh, which is still being excavated today. The city of Shiloh is an ongoing excavation, which is very, very cool. From that tent tabernacle at Shiloh, Joshua actually sends out 3 men from each tribe of Israel to go take a survey of the land, go make a map of the land, and bring back that map, bring back that information. And that's what they used with the Urim and the Thummim before the tabernacle of God to divide up the land of Israel. We also learn about the tribal allotments, this land inheritance of the tribe of Benjamin here in chapter 18. Okay, chapter 19, all about tribal allotments. So we've got Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, Dan, and some of the stories. There's a lot of boundaries that are being in here, and there's some little stories peppered into chapter 19, and these stories will be fleshed out in the book of Judges. And then we learn about Joshua at the very end of this chapter and his special portion. Just like Caleb, he asked specifically for a city named Timnath-Serah, which is pretty cool. He asked for a very specific city and got it as his inheritance. Joshua chapter 20 is all about the cities of refuge. They're appointed, so they're officially named. Remember, Moses named 3 of them on the east side of the Jordan River, and now they're appointing the other 3 on the west side of the Jordan River. There's also a summary of what the cities of refuge were. So a place of refuge, a place of sanctuary for someone guilty of manslaughter, unintentionally killing another human being. And there's also a note that this is both for the Israelite and the foreigner among them. This is just now the law of the land. Joshua chapter 21, towns for the Levites are given from Shiloh. Towns for the 3 different, sub-clans in the tribe of Levi, which of course are the Kohathites, Gershonites, and Merarites. I wanted to read to you verses 43 to 45. So let me grab that here because it summarizes a big chunk of history here. It says this: "So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give to their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled." So while we may not read this and think, oh, it sounds very peaceful and very wonderful at this point, because we know that the Israelites were not fully successful as of yet in driving out the inhabitants of Canaan, but they were living in relative peace at this time when they were dividing the land. So there were no more alliances of enemy kings coming at Israel. They weren't being oppressed, and their enemies were gradually leaving as they were taking over the land city by city and bit by bit. So this was seen as a fulfillment of the promise of God, and now the Israelites were able to rest. So that brings us into Joshua chapter 22, where Joshua then appropriately sends Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh back over to the east side of the Jordan River, because remember, they had asked for that to be their inheritance, but the rule was, they struck a deal with Moses. Well, you have to go into the promised land and help your brothers get conquer territory, and then you can go back home and have that territory as your inheritance. So that's what happens. Interestingly, in chapter 22, on their way home to the other side of the Jordan River, they stop at the Jordan River and they build an altar, a replica of the altar that has been built at Shiloh in front of the tent tabernacle, and then they go on home. Now, when word spreads around the rest of the tribes of Israel, they are very offended at this. In fact, so offended that the assembly of Israel is called at Shiloh. All of the elders, all of the tribes meet at the city of Shiloh, and they decide that they're going to go to war with Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. Now, because a civil war would have been a very big deal at this point, they send Phinehas, who's the son of Eleazar the priest, and some delegates from each of the tribes on that side of the Jordan River, and they send them over to try to find out what's going on. I'm going to read you why they think that this is worthy of warfare. So I want to read to you chapter 22, verses 18 to 20. 18b, I'm going to start halfway through. This is what they said to the tribes once they got over there. "If you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow he will be angry with the whole community of Israel. If the land you possess is defiled, come over to the Lord's land where the tabernacle stands and share the land with us. But do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar for yourselves other than the altar of the Lord our God. When Achan, son of Zerah, was unfaithful in regards to the devoted things, did not wrath come on the whole community of Israel? He was not the only one who died for his sin." So they have taken this building of an altar at the site of the Jordan River as apostasy, as idol worship, as a replacement for the tent tabernacle and the true worship of God that's going on in Shiloh. Now, luckily, that's not what the meaning of the altar was. When the tribes explain it, it was purely ceremonial. It was not to be used for burnt offerings or anything like that. It was a sign a sign of unity. So in the future, there would be a physical representation of the unity of Israel. That altar is literally a replica of the altar of the true God. Basically a sign saying the people who inhabit this land follow the same God. So it all turned out to be okay, but it seemed to have been a very tense moment in Joshua chapter 22. Okay, Joshua chapter 23, we get a reminder and a warning to the nation of Israel from a very aged Joshua. He's coming to the end of his life. He's warning them to follow God. It's the same warnings that we hear back in Moses. Follow God, otherwise it's going to go really poorly for you. In chapter 24, Joshua renews the covenant one last time at good old Shechem with Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And this is where that famous saying comes from, that famous saying in Christianity, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That's from here. That's from the renewal of the covenant, where Joshua puts out in front of them, you can worship these gods, you can worship these pagan gods, but you need to choose today. Are you going to worship them, or are you going to worship God? And they choose God. They renew the covenant. Joshua, we get a record of him dying. He died when he was 110 years old, and he was buried at that city that was his inheritance, Timnath-Serah. It's also called Timnath-Heres a little bit later on. And we get some final wrapping up matters from this time period. So we're told that the bones of Joseph, brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem. And we're told that Eleazar, the son of Aaron, when he dies, he's buried in Gibeah, which was owned by his son Phinehas, also a priest. And we're also told that during the lives of Joshua and Eleazar and all of the elders of that time period that outlived them, Israel followed God and didn't fall into apostasy. So it's all sounding really good when we end Joshua. But then we move into the book of Judges, and it goes south very, very quickly. In Judges chapter 1, kind of go back and forth in time a little bit when Joshua's with them and Joshua's gone. But let's focus on Judges chapter 1 first. So we learn all about the campaigns, the battle campaigns of the tribe of Judah. So we get this really weird account of them defeating Adonai-Bezek, a pagan king, and they cut off his thumbs and his toes, which seems like really cruel and unusual punishment, until coming out of his own mouth, we find out that that's what he has done to all of his captives, is he's cut off his thumbs and his toes. We also learn more details about that marriage arrangement, that really the marriage contest that Caleb sets up. Whoever can take this city, I will allow them to marry into my family. And her asking for the springs of water is also in this. We learn that the descendants of Moses' father-in-law are called Kenites, and they are living in amongst the tribe of Judah, but as their own tribe. And a whole bunch of different exploits of some of the tribes of Judah as they try to take over land. We also learn that many of the Canaanites that the Israelites are not successfully pushing out, they're not destroying them. They're not killing them. They're enforcing labor upon them. So they're becoming vassal cities, paying tribute, working, paying taxes in the form of crops, things of that nature. In Judges chapter 2, the angel of the Lord actually indicts the Israelites for not continuing on their mission to destroy all of the idols and the pagan altars in the land of Canaan. There's another record of Joshua's death here, and we learn some really bad news, that the generation of those who knew the Lord and who knew Joshua die, and the next generation that raises up, the Bible actually says that they neither knew the Lord nor did they remember any of the things that the Lord had done for Israel. This is very, very bad news. And to prove it to you, I'm going to read to you a summary of the entire book of Judges, essentially, here in Judges chapter 2. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord and the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than the ways of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. That is a perfect summary of the book of Judges, and we are only in chapter 2. So this is not going to be a book that is uplifting. This is not going to be a book about how amazing the relationship between God and man can be. This is exactly the opposite. This is a cesspool of humanity, and it's going to be pretty brutal. There's going to be some cool things sprinkled in there too, but it's going to be pretty brutal. This is the warning of Judges from Judges itself. Okay, Judges chapter 3, we learn that Othniel, the guy who won the competition and got to marry into Caleb's family with his cool sounding daughter, he ends up being the first judge of Israel. He defeated an enemy king that had subjugated the Israelites for 8 years. And we're told that Othniel ruled in peace for 40 years. We then learn about the judge Ehud, still in chapter 3. Eglon, king of Moab, had oppressed Israel from the city of Jericho for 18 years, and Ehud ends up assassinating him, and then there's peace in the land for 80 years. We learn about Shamgar. Well, we don't really learn about him. We're just told about him. There's no details here other than he killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Judges chapter 4, we learn about Deborah, the prophet. She led Israel. She judged Israel. The enemy king is that of the king of Hatzor, who's ruling over the land of Canaan at this time. Deborah sends for a man named Barak and tells him that God has commissioned him to defeat this king of Hatzor and Sisera, his commander. Long story short, the Kenites, the descendants of Moses's father-in-law and brother-in-law, they end up playing a key role in delivering Israel, specifically the wife of a Kenite named Jael. She single-handedly kills Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army. In Judges chapter 5, we have this very interesting song of Deborah that also lets us know that these judges aren't going in succession one after the other. Some of these judges overlapped in time. Now, unfortunately, we don't know how many judges overlapped or when they overlapped, so putting together a timeline is a little bit dicey for that reason. But chapter 5, Song of Deborah, very interesting. Judges chapter 6, we learn about Gideon, the reluctant judge of Israel. The Midianites had been oppressing Israel for 7 years. The Israelites cry out. God raises up a prophet that tells them that the reason why they're in subjugation is because of their idolatry. And God ends up calling Gideon to help them despite this idolatry. Gideon has to tear down his father's altar. He scared, so he does it at night, and he earns the name Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend with him. And this was his father's response to the other villagers who wanted to kill Gideon for having the gall to tear down an altar to Baal. And his dad says, basically, are you trying to fight Baal, the Lord of Heaven's battles for him? Let Baal contend with him. So that's a really interesting story in Judges chapter 6. Judges chapter 7, Gideon begins to defeat the Midianites with only 300 men, and he ends up getting the rest of the tribes of Israel to help him chase them down when he gets them on the run. Chapter 8, we learn about Gideon's vengefulness. It's very brutal. He kills men from a city who wouldn't give his army food on the way, and he wants his young son to execute some of the enemy commanders because they had killed his family. Pretty brutal. Gideon refuses to become the king of Israel, even though the men want him to. But he does ask for spoils of war, for gold. And from this, the Bible says he makes himself an ephod, which probably means he made himself an image and an ephod. That was a very common practice in the ancient world. Perhaps it was an image of the angel of the Lord that he had seen, that, to commemorate the event. But nevertheless, the Bible says that this idol became a snare to Gideon and his family, and the Israelites began to worship it. So not good. Okay, we also learn that Gideon had many wives and 70 sons. Yikes. But one particular son was by a concubine, so a lesser wife in the city of Shechem. His name was Abimelech. Now, in Judges chapter 9, Abimelech becomes a problem. He murders all of his half-brothers, all of the 70 sons of Gideon, except for the youngest. The youngest escapes by hiding. And Abimelech is actually crowned the king of Shechem. And he's the king of Shechem in Israel for 3 years until Shechem begins to turn, the city of Shechem begins to turn against him. Abimelech ends up destroying the city of Shechem, burning down a fortress with a bunch of citizens in it, about 1,000 citizens. He goes to another city to take that city. It's named Thebez. And a woman throws a millstone. A millstone was used for grinding grain, probably about this big, kind of mortar and pestle style. She throws it at his head, hits him dead on, and he ends up dying of his wounds. It's a very sad story, and basically the point is Abimelech gets his punishment, Shechem gets their punishment for being unfaithful. Judges chapter 10, Tola, the judge of Israel, saves them, and there's peace for 23 years. We're not told anything else about him. Jair, for 22 years, not told much about him either. Jephthah, here we go, Jephthah. We are told quite a bit about Jephthah, and it's brutal in chapter 10 here. We're told that the Philistines and the Amorites have been oppressing Israel for 18 years. And then in Judges chapter 11, we learn that Jephthah is essentially the scoundrel child of a prostitute who had been driven away from Gilead, the place of his birth, by the legitimate sons of his father. Now, because he's driven away from home, he ends up becoming a really mighty warrior. And in Gilead's time of need, when the Philistines and the Amorites, start to oppress Gilead, they actually call for Jephthah to come back and be their leader. And they say, we'll make you the commander of Gilead, the ruler. So Jephthah agrees, and he ends up sending a pretty interesting message in chapter 11 to the king of the Ammonites, who is coming against Gilead. And it's actually full of technical errors. So we learn right away that Jephthah doesn't really know his history. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. So this is really not a good sign. For example, he names the wrong god. He says that they worship one chief god, but actually we know they were worshiping a different chief god. He gets some of the details of Israel's history wrong. Then, to make matters worse, Jephthah makes a really dumb vow to God, probably trying to acquire spiritual power, that if God allows him to have victory over the enemy, that he will sacrifice as a burnt offering the first thing that comes out of his house. Now, animals were kept in houses, courtyard houses at this time, but he had a kid. Like, he knew the possibility was there. But unfortunately, this is not a period of time marked by intelligence towards God at all. And remember, the record of bad behavior here is not the Bible affirming this bad behavior, saying this is what you should do. It's actually the opposite. The book of Judges is all about how bad humanity is away from God. Okay, so Jephthah ends up having to sacrifice. He didn't have to sacrifice his daughter, but his daughter, his only child, is the first thing that comes out of his house when he comes back from war, and he's heartbroken because he doesn't want to offer her as a burnt sacrifice. This whole situation is very ironic because the nation that he just defeated is known, or was known, for sacrificing their children. The God of Israel, in the book of Moses, the books of the law, does not accept child sacrifice. And yet Jephthah becomes just like his enemies, and he sacrifices his daughter to a God who does not accept that. Now, also ironic, if he knew the law of Moses, he knew that he could have redeemed his daughter by just giving money instead of offering her as a burnt sacrifice. It's pretty awful. In Judges chapter 12, the tribe of Ephraim threatens to kill Jephthah and burn his house down on top of his own head for not including them in the battle. They probably wanted the money. Warfare could be very lucrative because you got to steal all your enemy's wealth and supplies. Ephraim ends up being beaten very badly and killed indiscriminately by Jephthah and his men from Gilead. So the whole point of this Jephthah story, when you look at it, is that people are destroyed by their own sinful actions. See, the Spirit of God empowered Jephthah for warfare to deliver Israel from their enemies, but his own mouth and his lack of knowledge of God's law guaranteed the destruction of his own house, his only child. And Ephraim's greed and their want for valor, their want for honor, highlighted Jephthah's plight, because they say, we're going to burn your house down over your own head. But Jephthah had already burnt his own house down. He offered his only child as a burnt sacrifice. He had already done that himself. And Ephraim's greed and their want for honor then gets them viciously beaten in battle and picked off as they try to escape. This is the state of Israel, the state of mankind, when they turn away from God. It's chaos and death. This is the point of the brutal story of Jephthah. Some following matters that we learn about in Judges chapter 12, the judge Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. Some of these lesser judges that we don't know much about, but they still delivered Israel, so they are mentioned by name. I wish we knew more about them. In Judges chapter 13, which is the last chapter that we're going to look at today, we have the beginning of infamous Samson. Samson is born in chapter 13. The Philistines have been oppressing Israel for 40 years, and the angel of the Lord appears to a barren woman and tells her that she is going to have a child that she needs to right away eat as a Nazirite, because she needs to raise her son as a Nazirite because he is going to deliver Israel. And there we have it. That is our reading summarized this week. I hope that you're doing well. How's your Bible reading going? Let me know down below. Are you caught up? Have you fallen behind? Are you struggling with Judges? Do you have any questions about anything that we've read this week? Pop it down in the comments below. I will be watching. I apologize for not being able to get back to you as fast as I wanted to last week. I'm hopefully going to be able to do both last week's questions and this week's questions this week. This past week has just been a bit nuts for me, but we're here now. We're at the weekend. It's a new week. It's a new week of Bible reading. So I hope you have a really good one. And I hope that you're excited that we are moving into the historical sections of the Bible. They are some of my absolute favorite. Anyway, I will stop talking now, and I will talk to you in the comments. Bye.